Hello, lovely.
Hi, Ellie. How are you today?
Good. Hi, Deborah. How you doing?
Excellent. I think we're good.
Okay, great.
Okay. Well, thanks for helping students get a little window into your world and for joining me today to just talk about your work. I'm super excited to share your work with everyone. Maybe the first thing you might want to do is tell me about how you began to explore art as a means of visual expression.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Deborah. I uh, I actually started making art not that long ago. It was about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. I was inspired by watching my kid just play fearlessly with all the art products that we had around, the watercolor and the finger paints and drawing and sketching. She was just fearless. She was pretty young at the time. Prior to exploring art, I really thought of myself more as a storyteller. And I've used a variety of different creative outlets and methods to tell my story. I've used writing and photography and music and film. And so art was the latest medium that I was exploring. And so I started getting more into it over time. I started off with some crafty projects, making cards for friends and stuff like that, and it just kept growing and building. And I started exploring painting in many different forms. And so I have been doing art full time for about 3 years now.
Wow. Well, let's take a look at some of your art.
Okay.
There's your beautiful face and onto your beautiful paintings. So this piece is called Inheritance, and I'm looking at it and it makes me wonder, how do you start a painting? How do you approach that process?
Um, a lot of my paintings, most of my paintings, I would say, they start off as a complete, fun, intuitive, just gestural explorations. If I'm thinking about a passage of writing, I might write it on the blank canvas. Anything to disrupt that blank canvas, which can be a little bit imposing in the beginning, you know? So I'll write words on it. I will paint boldly with colors that just bring me joy that day. For big paintings, like this one was actually a pretty big painting, I will start off by painting several coats of varying contrasting colors just to get the painting started and to start building up a history that I can later go back and mine through. So on that painting, I think I painted a whole layer of yellow and then red and then brown and then blue. And then I started scraping back and exploring the painting.
I can see that now that you describe it. I'm also wondering about the title here, and if you could say a little bit more about what made you decide to give it the name Inheritance.
Sure. Well, a lot of the titles of my pieces don't come to me until late in the process. And so oftentimes, like, I'll have to get it out of the studio and hang it up somewhere in the house where I can just sort of see it in passing, to see what's working and what's not working. And at this time, I had this hanging in the kitchen, and my husband, who is a biologist, was looking at the painting, and he just noticed that those three circles that are on the left side with the lines going through them, it reminded him sort of of an abstract DNA strand, a strand of DNA with the ladder,
The helix.
the helix, exactly, the double helix. And I started thinking about it, and I was thinking about also when I was working on this piece, it looked it was the first time I did a piece that looked a little bit like patchwork, like a quilt, a little bit of a grid, like networks. Like, it just looked very symmetrical in a way that was new to me in my painting. And I was thinking about patchworks and quilts while I was making this, and I was thinking about the stories that go into making us who we are, the stories that we inherit from our parents and our grandparents and our ancestors, and the stories that I'm now passing down to my kid about who she is and where she comes from. And so between my husband mentioning that it reminded him of an abstract DNA and my thinking about the quilt-like patterns, it made me think about these stories that I've inherited, that I'm now digesting through my art to try to better understand, so that I have a better, so I can pass something down to my kid that is tangible, that can help her understand who she is and where she comes from as well.
Those layers of meaning. I totally
Yeah.
understand what you're saying. Let's take another painting. I'm really enjoying this one in a similar way. Maybe you could describe your process of mark making and how you come to the decision of making that next layer. Like, what happens for you that makes you decide to paint over a color or scrape back into a color? It's a kind of, I think, difficult thing to articulate how that happens.
Yeah, it is very intuitive. So like I said in the beginning, when I start off, I'm not thinking about where I'm going at all. I don't have a plan. I don't have an end product in mind. I am just literally just making marks on the canvas, especially if it's big. I get to sort of paint with big gestures, and it's very freeing and liberating to do that. And then I start adding the coats of color. But the painting really starts coming to life when I start scraping away. Some of the layers that are on top, I can gouge into them. I can lay down a layer of paint and then immediately sort of wipe some of it off and see what sort of pokes through. And then I start like in the middle part when I'm thinking about layering and what to keep and what to add. It's all just responding to what I like and what I don't like, and paying attention to what's catching my eye and what I'm drawn towards, and thinking about, yeah, but I'm still not necessarily thinking about an end product. I'm really just responding to the painting that is emerging on the canvas. So with this one, I think I was, so sometimes it'll just feel too dark in an area, so I'll brighten it up, but then it'll be too bright, so then I'll scrape it back, and then that looks a little bit less jarring. And so with this one, you can see on the top right area, again, I have that circle pattern with the lines kind of going through it. It's a little bit less obvious than the other one, but again, it reminded me of the stories that we passed down. And so I worked with that idea, and the red line came into it, and it made me think about like just sort of the bloodlines that connect us, and thinking about being pregnant with my daughter, and just sort of remembering a time when we were one, when there was no division between her and me, and everything that I was experiencing and taking in, she was also taking in. And so that's really what this piece is thinking about. And then like how those bloodlines continue even when you give birth and they're now making their own way out into the world. There is still always that connection. So
that's really poignant. And I think it's a great lesson in trusting your intuition.
Yeah.
And nurturing that voice. A lot of times I think in life we're taught not to do that. And this is very encouraging just to see someone who does it really well. Maybe you wouldn't mind taking us a little brief walk through your studio where you work.
Yeah, of course. I'd be happy to. Okay. Well, I do want to say something, actually. I regret not having more work around to be able to share with you, because usually in my studio, I have lots and lots of pieces, lots of works piled up that are in varying stages of being done. And but right now, most of my work is out in the world and exhibiting to no one right now. But so I do wish I had more pieces around, because then I could really sort of break things down and show you a little bit more. I have during this time been playing a lot with acrylics for the first time ever. And so some of the stuff that's around here is actually very new to me. And I'm exploring a new visual medium, paint medium, and trying to figure out my way around this new medium, which is very fun, but it's also, I'm definitely learning, and you'll see that if you see some of these pieces. It's pretty green. So, okay, so this is, I'll show you generally where I was sitting. This is my main work table. I was working on my acrylics today, and so I generally like to work on several pieces at a time. That's kind of how I teach myself. I work on several pieces, build it at the same time, and then inevitably one of them will sort of stand out as my favorite thing that I made that day. And I will look at it and try to understand why I'm feeling so strongly about that piece, why I'm loving that piece so much. What is it? Is it the colors? Is it the contrast? Is it the texture? What is it about this piece that I'm loving? And then I will sort of take some of those lessons and emulate that in some of my other pieces. And inevitably another piece will emerge as my favorite the next day, and I'll keep learning that way. So that's kind of how I teach myself when I'm learning a new medium, is just sort of learning by doing.
I love it.
So this little area back here, this is a station where I have several paints set up where I actually, one of the ways that I used to paint, or I sometimes paint, is with encaustic medium. And basically what that is I melt beeswax and resin, Damar resin, and then I pigment that melted beeswax, and I can paint with that, and you can really build up a lot of layers with that, and the whole studio smells amazing. So let's see, moving along here, this is my most recent piece that is currently in limbo. It's a bigger piece. I started this before we went on, before we all ended up being quarantined, and it went through many different stages, and I'm too close to it. I can't tell if it's working or not working, so it's actually been sitting in a timeout in another part of the house, but I brought it in to have something to show you. But you can actually see in this piece writing like from earlier layers that are in there. I don't know if you can see that, Deborah, can you?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and down here, like layers. So this used to be so many different things. There's writing in here. There's places where I scratched into it. So there's just, the layers build up and I can never predict where it's gonna end up. This is an area where I usually do my, I need a clean area to do some of calligraphy or drawing or painting on paper where it's not gonna get paint all over it. So this is generally where I do that. And then this is
Nice.
so a lot of storage and the shipping stuff for packing and shipping paintings. This is a piece that I started last year. It was experimenting with several different media. I really only like the basket part on top, but it was fun to explore doing a cast of my face for the first time. This is where I keep all of my paints and more paintings up top.
Very organized.
Today. And then here are some pieces that are actually like ideas, like seeds of ideas. Like I said, I don't really know where they're going. I've had this cut out of my head on this 24 by 24 panel. I don't know if you can tell that that's me.
Not really, but that's okay.
You can't really tell. Okay. So like I have different ideas. This piece behind it is one that I just started. I was working with graphite on another piece, and I was using this painting as a backdrop. It's like an early board. And I had some coffee, so I decided to take the coffee and rub the graphite into it, and then and see what it would do and play around with it a little bit. So it made some interesting textures, but that's just the first stages of getting a piece started. This is another one where it has actually a lot of transcripts from interviews with my family members from a movie project that I did. And this all just sort of collaged on there. That will be like the base layer of another painting. Again, I don't know where that's going.
Yeah, I love how you're just building up these layers of history to figure out, you know, kind of your bearings and get going.
Yeah, so it's always a process of discovery. It's always very interesting to see where things end up. I'm also like a fan of not wasting anything. I always have bins of papers, of scraps, of things that I've done in the past. Sometimes it's, sorry for all the moving around, but it might be like, you know,
no worries,
little remnants or pieces from projects. This one has pictures of my family on it, papers that might end up getting collaged into other projects. So yeah, so I have lots of different piles of memorabilia and bike chains and all sorts of things that might end up in future paintings, that I can't predict. But if something catches my eye.
That kind of segues nicely into my last question for you, which is, how do you figure out how to finish something? How do you know when something is done?
That is like $1 million question. That is really what I have found is, as I'm working on a painting and I'm building layers and I'm noticing what I'm responding to, and I keep some things and I lose other things. Sometimes I can get a little bit too tight too early, where I'm getting very, very precious about, oh, I really love the way this one little passage happened over here and I want to keep it. And I try to keep it like pristine and safe from all the other messes going on the painting. And then inevitably it just, when I sort of like look at the whole piece, it just doesn't work. It hasn't evolved at the same rate as the rest of the painting. And so I will take a picture of the part that I love so that it's always preserved, and then I will paint over it, and it will sort of keep going and evolving. But then something will happen, something will catch my eye, and the whole piece will start telling a story that I couldn't predict, but I start to see something in it. And then I will work to try to really bring that vision to reality. And I will get close, and inevitably there'll be something that's not quite right. Like, that's where I feel like this painting is right now, is that it's close to telling a story, but there's something about it that's it's not resolved. And so I have to take it out of the studio. I have to stop working on it and just get it into my daily living space. I'll hang it up in the kitchen. I will lean it against the wall in the living room, so that I just sort of am seeing it casually in a living space as I'm moving around. And then I'll start to notice, oh, you know what? That color is really not working, or there's just a whole muddy area there that's unresolved. Or when I get back into there, I need to make those whites whiter because it really needs that kind of contrast. So I'll start to troubleshoot. So much of art making for me is problem solving. And so I'll start to like think about it and like figure out, what do I need to do so that I can be at peace with this. And once I figure out what my moves need to be, I will bring it back into the studio, put it on the easel, and I will make those final moves. And sometimes it's tiny, sometimes it's a tiny change. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, yeah, okay, that feels done. And when I can scan over the whole painting and not feel like there's anything that's catching me or making me mad, or or that feels unresolved, when I feel like it's at peace, then I feel like it's done. And sometimes it's just done for now. There have been so many pieces that I've gone on to show that feel great, and I show them, and at a gallery or in a coffee shop or whatever, I bring it back into the studio, and I'll look at it a year later, I'll pull it out, and it's not doing it for me anymore. And I've grown and I've evolved, and I will turn it upside down, and I might paint over it and just keep going with it, because there's at least that history there. Again, there's like the history that I can always build on and scrape back to and excavate. It's just all adding to the richness of the final painting. But usually if I'm still loving a piece after a year, it doesn't change. So I think all the ones you showed are ones that are pretty set. They're pretty stable. Yeah.
I think that's really true, that you have to allow yourself time to live with them. And it's coming to that point where you just see nothing in it that needs changing anymore. You're just like, it's at rest and everything makes sense and nothing's bugging you. And it's like, okay, I'm done. But getting to that point is hard to do quickly.
Yeah.
And I just want to say to students, I know that you're working on a completely different kind of timeline, and I'm asking you to turn something in on a due date. So you don't have quite that amount of freedom, but hopefully you can get a taste of that, what Ellie's talking about there. But Ellie, thank you so much for sharing with us. I love your work, and I think you're going to inspire a lot of people. by letting me share it with them. So I'm really grateful. Thank you, dear.
Thank you so much, Deborah. We'll see you
All right.
soon. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.